Then my programming background kicked in, and I could see with the Dogon symbols that they were using techniques that a programmer would use when they design a symbol. A good programmer learns over time to incorporate hints and clues into the form of the symbol itself. If you create a field name in a program that's supposed to represent an invoice number, you don't call it XYZ123, you call it INVNO. And I could see that these symbols were using those kinds of techniques, and that said to me somebody must have designed them. Somebody who knew enough about designing symbols to have used those techniques. So that convinced me I was on the right track. I was looking at design symbols and gave me the impetus to spend 10 years researching it.
In his book, he starts out looking into the cosmology of the Dogon. This is a tribe living in a remote section of faraway Mali in Western Africa. And the Dogon were brought into prominence and no little notoriety initially in the 50s by two anthropologists who worked with them for 30 years, Marcel Griol and Germain Dieterlen. In two books, one called Conversations with Ogo Tonelli, who was a blind old Dogon shaman, and secondly in a book called The Pale Fox. These works were certainly not, they weren't bestsellers. These works were fairly specialized and were known only to a few. They were popularized and brought into serious bestseller prominence by Robert Temple. Temple was struck by the fact, recorded by Griol and Dieterlen, but not developed, that the star Sirius was the prime focus of Dogon religious worship, but more remarkable, that the Dogon apparently knew that Sirius was orbited by an invisible dwarf star called Sirius B. Sirius B was only discovered by our modern-day telescopes in, I think, the 1950s. It might have been the 1930s, but anyway, relatively recent times. So how did the Dogon, without telescopes and without any apparent formal astronomy, decide upon Sirius and Sirius B as the focal points of their worship? There's absolutely no way that the Dogon, without access to some sort of long-lost information or some way of accessing knowledge that we don't have, figured out or knew that the star Sirius is orbited by a dwarf star. The rest of the symbology and mythology of the Dogon is equally mysterious.
I can imagine a group of teachers sitting down today and saying, actually I've read discussions, scientific discussions from scientists from NASA, just brainstorming if we had to create some kind of a structure here to let another culture know that we were there. What would we possibly do? What kind of a set of symbols would we come up with that would survive for a long enough period of time for an unsophisticated culture to grow to a level of sophistication where they would could then understand that we had been there? That's exactly what this set of symbols does, and I'm very, very impressed with whoever developed them. Very stable set of understandable symbols that could be applied to three different important creational storylines and create one set of myths that encompassed all three storylines. The three storylines are the structure of matter, the structure of reproduction and genetics, and the third storyline is the surface storyline, which really explains how these symbols were taught to the Dogon. Amma's egg, which is the unformed universe, opens, and the first thing that emerges is what the Dogon call the Po, which is the equivalent of the hydrogen atom, actually. And along that storyline, the numbers 2 and 8 become important. 2 in that storyline represent a twin pair, which are, I take to be, the hydrogen atoms, which tend to form twin pairs. 8 represent the electron structure of oxygen, which combines with hydrogen to form water, and which gets us to the water symbol, which is so pervasive. We're talking about waters of chaos. Actually, the waters of chaos may be a more literal statement than we think. These days, many astronomers feel that the more usual form of a solar system involves two stars, not one, a binary pair of stars. And that in the solar systems where there isn't a binary pair, like ours, there's a sun and a very large planet that, had it been slightly more massive, might have attained fusion and become a second star. So if you look at our solar system, you realize what you've got are two potential stars and 8 potential planets, as opposed to 1 star and 9 planets, and that 2 and 8 is the electron structure of water. So when they talk about waters of chaos, they may be speaking more literally than it seems. Okay, so the Po emerges when the unformed universe opens. The Po represents the atom. There are many qualities in the discussion of the Po that tell us that it's the atom. It exhibits many of the same qualities. The Po is actually made up of electrons, protons, and neutrons, which are themselves made up of 4 more fundamental groups of particles. The electron is a good particle to discuss because the shape that it forms when it orbits the nucleus of an atom is a very distinctive shape, and a great one for someone to then pick up on and say, okay, we're going to use this as a symbol in our mythology. It's something that a researcher later on can get back to and say, aha, this shape is an electron orbit. And so the Sene is represented, yes, exactly by this symbol, which is very similar to the electron orbit of an atom. Okay, so now you have the Po consisting of Sene seeds, which act like electrons. They also behave just like protons and neutrons. They combine together at the center of the Po the way that protons and neutrons combine to form the nucleus of an atom. So they've got their descriptions right up until that point. I realized that very early in my research that they had those symbols right. So now as I was wrestling with what they describe as the germination of the Sene seed, which would be the components that make up the Sene seed, I said, well, if we've got these other symbols right, it makes sense to look into what science says about the components of electrons, protons, and neutrons. And I found out very quickly that the symbol that the Dogon use to represent the germination of the Sene, which are four drawn symbols, these 4 symbols seem rather obscure, but once you get into the science of it, you get into what Stephen Hawking says about the groupings of particles, quantum particles that form up, that combine to form electrons, neutrons, and protons. Those particles are combined into 4 groups based on a property called spin. Spin tells us really what the particle looks like from different angles. Science is able to probe these particles and get a sense of if you look at them at different sides, what do they look like? There are four types of particles. One looks the same from all sides. One looks the same only if you turn it halfway around. One looks the same if you turn it all the way around. And the last one doesn't look the same until you turn it around twice, which suggests that there's something funky going on with time and space under the covers there to make it so that you have to turn it twice to get it to look the same. Those properties are exhibited by the Dogon diagrams, so their 4 categories match up with Stephen Hawking because of those descriptions of the spin particle.